everyone, welcome back to Cryptoria. This is another English episode for us. I'm the co-host Vivian.
This is Gia.
For this episode, we've already done 2 episodes to talk about what about Ether. Our topic is all about what happens with Ether. We talked about Ethereum Ultra Money Sound Thesis. And we talk about layer 2. So this is our last episode about what happens with Ether. But this episode is very special because we invite one of our guests. As original thinking that we want to talk about Ether's inflation. But because we met him on the DevCon conversation and he just gave a fabulous talk about Ether is the permissionless money. So I think that is very good. We want to invite him to be our conclusion episodes about what happens with Ether. And I think his insight and opinion is very insightful. I'd like to invite our guest to do the self-introduction. Okay, Mike?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Hey, so my name's Mike. I work at the Ethereum Foundation. I live in New York, but I'm spending the winter in Colorado. So it was really fun to meet you guys at DevCon. And I guess the kind of title of my talk and kind of what I've been thinking most about and writing about lately is called ETH is permissionless money. And so hopefully we'll get to walk through some of these things on the episode today, but I split the talk into what it means for ETH to be permissionless and then what it means for ETH to be money. And so, if you want to check out the talk, hopefully that'll be useful and we'll probably cover some of those themes today.
Yeah, we covered your talk on our DevCon recap. So if anyone who's interested, just feel free to go through our last episodes and there is a talk link on the show notes. Okay, so welcome, Mike. You forgot to introduce yourself as a researcher of Ethereum Foundation. Yeah, so I think you definitely got a lot of the good insight. So then I'll go for my first questions is, as one of the Ethereum Foundation's researchers, you've been deeply involved in the network's economic design. So could you start by sharing your perspective on the most significant economic change since the merge?
Yeah. So I might actually start this by saying, even going before the merge, because I think there's some really interesting monetary features that changed through the network before the merge. So initially when Ethereum was launched in 2015, there was a 5 Ether per block reward. And I guess the first thing when we're talking about monetary aspects of Ether, the first thing we usually end up talking about is issuance. So that's how much new Ether is created through the process of creating these blocks, right? So at Genesis, there was 5 Ether created for every block. So every 12 seconds, that's 5 new Ether, which is quite a lot, right? And then over the course of time until the merge happened, there were actually 3 important events that kind of significantly changed the monetary properties. So first, the 5 ETH block reward was reduced to 3, and then it was reduced to 2. And I guess the point of calling out these changes is that the kind of original version of the block reward was kind of just an estimate, right? Like it was just like 5 Ether seemed like a relatively round number to choose. And as a result, there kind of wasn't too much thought that went into reducing it from 5 to 3 and then 3 to 2. It was just like, it seems like we could probably get away with reducing the block reward by a few. And then the third important thing that I'll call out that changed before the merge was the activation of EIP 1559. And we'll talk about this more later on, but this is when a portion of the transaction fees on the network started getting burned. So the burn is kind of this confusing mechanism that's only really possible in crypto terms, because it's actually like a destruction of the tokens themselves, right? So we send those tokens to a place where they're no longer accessible, and that effectively acts as a counterbalance to the inflationary pressures. So we'll talk about that more later on, but I thought kind of, and in my DEF CON talk, I did a similar recounting of the history, and I think going up to the merge, there was a lot of stuff that is worth calling out too. So then, at the merge, there was a big change, which is, so suddenly we no longer have proof of work, right? So the merge is just the moment where we switched from proof of work to proof of stake, a pretty crazy thing to happen. But all of those block rewards that were previously 2 ETH per block just completely go away, right? So that's a huge change. And now instead of rewarding people for mining blocks, we're rewarding people for staking. And the issuance curve that was defined at the time we'll go through that later, but effectively it basically is much, much, much less than 2 ether per block. It's, on the order of like 0.01 ether per block for participation in the proof of stake consensus. So that was a huge change. And then after the merge, there's been 2 hard forks. So the merge happened in September of 2022. So it's almost exactly 2 years ago now, and there's been 2 hard forks since then. The first one was called Capella, which happened in April of 2023. I have to get the dates right here. And this was a relatively small fork after the merge. And basically the only thing that changed was it activated withdrawals. So up until this point, all of the proof of stake, all of that stake that was put into the consensus mechanism of Ethereum was not withdrawable, right? So that means it was a one-way street. You sent it in there, you didn't know when you were going to get it out, which is kind of insane that people had that much trust in the system to send their tokens there. So past that point, withdrawals were activated and people were able to kind of take some of their ether out. And also this encouraged a lot more people to stake in the first place, because now they know that once they stake, they can get it out at any point. So this was kind of, when we think about significant events, this greatly changed the amount of stake that was in the network. It went from 15% to 25%. So, a massive increase, 66% increase. Because there was a huge de-risking around these withdrawals, and people were comfortable knowing that they could get their ether out. And then
I still remember. I still remember some of people's, and when they talking about, because before the Capella, I think that's just the DeFi summer. So most of the people said, "Oh, I stake a lot of my ethers, and I just watch the opportunities go away. I cannot use my ethers to invest those on the DeFi summer." Yeah.
Yeah, that was
sorry to interrupt.
No. It's kind of funny too, because at that point they had accumulated I think it was 6 ether or something. So they started with 32, and then it went all the way up to 38 or something, and they couldn't get access to any of it. So then the other hard fork that happened March of this year, and that was Deneb. And so Deneb was the kind of flagship EIP of that hard fork was EIP.58E, which created this blob space. So there's now kind of these external data blobs, or not really external, but external to the main payload of the execution layer. And these blobs are where rollups and other L2s kind of continue posting data for access to Ethereum block space. And the reason I guess there's kind of 2 reasons that this could impact the monetary properties of ETH. First is that there's a new fee mechanism for paying for that blob space, right? So previously to this, we only had kind of one mechanism, which is gas. And you pay for some gas, and a portion of the amount you pay for that gas gets burned. That's the 1559 mechanism. For blob space, there's a very similar burning apparatus where you pay to post a blob on chain, and some amount of the transaction fee that you paid for that blob, the blob fee, for lack of a better word, also gets burned. So that's kind of now you have 2 different burn sources. So that's the first thing that changed. The second thing that changed is it got much cheaper for L2s to post data to Ethereum, right? So previously, they had to actually use the call data of Ethereum transactions, which was quite an expensive resource. And as a result, they ended up burning a lot of ETH just by sending data over that call data. Switching their where they post the data to the blobs actually reduced their expenses by a lot. And so in a lot of ways, the actual burn on the L1 itself went down because the transaction fees that were kind of congesting the Ethereum execution layer itself were now being posted on the blobs instead. So this is kind of, I guess, a blessing and a curse, because now we're scaling Ethereum. We have much cheaper L2 transactions. If you look at the chart of L2 transaction fees, the day before 4844 and the day after, it goes from $1 to literally 1 cent. 100x. 100x decrease. It's really cool. Yeah. But obviously, this has the immediate downside of some of the burn goes down. And I think, again, this is something we'll probably talk about later on, but I think this is something we actually saw coming coming down the line, and I don't think it's actually a bad thing. Like I think it's just good. Like in net creation of block space is always going to be good. So yeah, that's the two kind of important things that have happened since the merge with regards to the Ether asset.
Yeah, we talked about the gas fees on our what happens with the Ethereum, and I think on the layer 2 episodes. And we got one experience. Last time we attend the ETH Global Sydney Hackathon, and you have to stake Ether, right? And I just tried to stake Ether on the mainnet. And I thought, oh my God, the gas fee is still so high. But then I transferred, but then I switched the network to the base. I said, the gas fee just like they put the symbol and it's less than 0.1, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. That is really, really cheap. But most of the questions is about if you earn less from the layer 2 from the gas fees, is that will affect Ether's values, blah blah blah. Those kind of the noises. But we kind of discuss about these questions on our last episodes. But what we are thinking is maybe that is good for the mass adoption, because a lot of our friends they may not the English speaking audiences. And when they thought about those gas, they'll say, oh, that is insane. I won't use those costs to invest some things with this high cost. That is not happened to me. In the real life, in the traditional ways, we can just use, just like one portion to the hundreds. That is the cost I'm willing to pay. But if you're talking about maybe some costs it even cost my twice of time, that is not going to happen to me. So I think if we talk about mass adoptions, if we talk about we want onboarding a lot of the more peoples, so the speed and the cost is much, much more important. And I think that is another ways we can increase the Ether's value. So I think the things always have the two sides, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it does feel very short term to say, hey, we need to be like charging more for block space now to ensure that like there's more burn. Like I think that's a very narrow approach, right? Like you said, we have to zoom out and say like, okay, if we want to onboard the next billion users or whatever, like they're not going to be willing to pay $1 to make a swap. Like that's just not acceptable. So yeah, it's great. Great that we're heading in that direction, I think.
Yeah. So basically, according to one of the recent Coinbase report, interpreting token inflation, quote, 99.98% reduction in energy consumption post-merge. Right. So how does the dramatic efficiency improvement affect the Ethereum's value propositions as a monetary asset? What's your take?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to kind of call out this, like why this reduction happened in the first place. And it's actually not because the previous design of Ethereum was like extremely bad, for example. It's actually because proof of work inherently is trying to consume energy. Like the explicit stated goal of proof of work is to consume electricity. So like the 99.99 reduction, it's not like that was a great improvement in how we're doing some algorithm or something like that. It's actually just like we fundamentally switched how we come to consensus, and this proof of stake version of this consensus mechanism doesn't rely on consuming electricity. So yeah, I think that's kind of the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is I think reduced electricity costs and reduced costs of like running the mining hardware, it can only be good for the asset, right? Because fundamentally, like if you think about the cost of running the hardware as essentially the amount you have to pay people to keep the network online and secure. There's kind of like two properties that we care about, liveness and safety, which is just like, do blocks keep getting produced? And if I send a transaction and it gets confirmed, it stays like in the ledger forever. It's immutable, right? So yeah, the point is like whatever the cost is to produce those properties, that's what we're going to have to pay out in issuance to incentivize people to participate in the consensus mechanism. So the payments that go to Bitcoin miners are in terms of the Bitcoin block reward, and in terms of Ethereum, there's these kind of staking rewards that you get for staking your ETH. So yeah, I guess the the takeaway here is that when you get rid of proof of work, you no longer have to pay the same amount of electricity fee and like hardware costs that miners would have to consume in order to produce blocks on the chain. So like that's just kind of baseline, extremely good. It's also worth calling out here that issuance isn't really a cost to the network, right? In the same way that I guess staking that like mining hardware and mining electricity are a cost. So issuance is paid out from people who are staked to people who are not staked, right? You can just think of it as like a redistribution. It's almost like if I start with 1 ETH and you start with 10 ETH and I'm staking and you're not, then at the end of like, let's say a year later, I have 2 ETH and you still have 10. Now I own 2/12 of the ETH instead of 1/11, which is like I increased my network share of Ether, but I didn't like take any money away from you. Like there was no cost here. It's just the relative portion of the Ether that you own is less. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the mental model for thinking about proof of stake is it's just kind of like redistributing the Ether rather than like an external cost to the network. Which is, I think, why proof of stake is much simpler. Like in terms of the cost to run the staking equipment, it's much lower. Like you just have to, run the software. It's relatively like the compute bandwidth and hardware requirements are relatively low compared to mining. So all in all, like the real takeaway here is that reducing the cost of running the network also reduces the amount of issuance that you have to pay in order to kind of keep this network online. So yeah, that's kind of the first thing I'd say. And then the other kind of point I want to make here is that by switching from proof of work to proof of stake and kind of generally the Ethereum roadmap as a whole vision of how to scale blockchains is like a core part of this is making Ethereum L1 a great settlement layer for L2s, right? So Vitalik vocalized this with what's called the rollup centric roadmap. But the whole point here is that basically like all of the changes that are being made to Ethereum are trying to increase its attractiveness to L2s for them to post their data to Ethereum and for them to use it as kind of the settlement layer. And what it means to be a settlement layer is kind of when assets are bridged from Ethereum into the rollup, Ethereum is the source of truth for those assets. And I think fundamentally, Ethereum still allows those assets to have the same property rights that they would on Ethereum, even while they're on the L2s. And we can kind of talk through that mechanism maybe a little bit later when we talk about permissionlessness. But fundamentally, like all of the changes Ethereum makes not only like scale Ethereum, the technology, but I also think they scale Ether, the asset, because now there's like more abundant block space where Ether can be used. Yeah, that's kind of a key part of the monetary properties and the monetary story of Ether.
Right. But some will argue that is the POW's high energy cost help to give Bitcoin its store value properties. So how will you respond to the concern that the POS efficiency may actually reduce the Ethereum's monetary premium?
Yeah, I've heard this argument before. It's a little confusing to me, honestly. I think part of it is I kind of understand where it's coming from, which is having hardware and electricity being consumed feels like it ties Bitcoin to the real world in some way, right? It's like you have this digital space, digital money, and now it's like connected to like a coal power plant. Like, this is physical meat space things that we can like wrap our head around. But I still don't actually think the argument fundamentally makes sense because you still have to pay for that. Like someone has to pay for that hardware and for that electricity. And fundamentally the people who are going to be paying are the ones who are like it's getting paid through the issuance itself. Now, of course, Bitcoin's issuance model is another thing that is kind of highly touted as what gives Bitcoin its monetary premium, which is they only have 21 million supply in total, right? They're never going to have more than 21 million Bitcoins in existence. And, I think this is a really good story, but it's still not clear to me that when you get to the point where the block rewards are actually zero, if the network is secure anymore, right? Because if you look at the block rewards right now, it's 3.125 Bitcoins per block, which is still about a 1% inflation rate per year. And, it's a $2 trillion asset now. That 1% of that is a lot of money, right? So there's still a huge amount of Bitcoin being paid out to people to do this mining and to subsidize this hardware consumption. But kind of when this stops happening after a few more halvenings, then I think it'll be more clear that like you don't necessarily want people to be paying for electricity. Like you want to be spending the minimum amount to secure the network. And I think that's the like key, like the cheaper is always going to be better in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I still find a lot of Bitcoin miners, especially during the bearish market, when the Bitcoin price is dropped below 80,000. And I think most of those miners, they'll start selling their Bitcoin assets after their mining and just wanting to keep their rolling, just keep to pay those utilities because those utility fees are so high. If you want to keep that much the miners and the software running. So I think that's in the one period of time, they do create some market tensions between the miners and the Bitcoin holders. So they don't want them to selling more to give some price pressure, And they do. I think on the year 2104, I think that is the year when the Bitcoin are gone, right? I think the year should be that year.
2104. Yeah.
Yeah, 2104.
It's a ways out still.
Yeah.
It's still far out. Yeah.
And a lot of people just thinking whether the Bitcoin network is still safe after that time. And so I think all the Bitcoin communities and ecosystem, they're still thinking, and they're trying to save all the Bitcoin network about the security sort of things. Yeah.
That's the reason why you have the Hive of Runes, right? They try to do something like similar to, NFT in Ethereum, but, whether it's successful or not, you tell.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and
we'll actually talk about this, I think, in a later question, but there's a really interesting kind of comparison you can make, which is like, basically, if Bitcoin succeeds on just transaction fees alone, then that could mean that, Ethereum's monetary policy could be net deflationary long-term because there's clearly sufficient demand for transaction fees, right? And so like maybe we'll be able to draw that comparison later on. But yeah, I think this is why this kind of Bitcoin renaissance or Bitcoin 2.0 is so important, because it's like the long-term security model doesn't make sense without people actually using the network. Like you can't just have everyone hold it. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah. So back to the Ethereum. So currently, there about 28% of the Ether is staked. So compared to the Solana's I think Solana is 68%. So what factors have influenced the more conservative staking ratio?
Yeah, so this is a super interesting fact, and kind of even apart from Solana, if you look at a lot of the other big proof of stake chains, Tezos, a lot of the Cosmos chains, many of them have like right around 60 to 70% of their total token supply staked. So I think there's a few things that that kind of benefit Ethereum. So first, I'll kind of explain why I think Ethereum has a lower stake rate, and then I'll also talk about why I think that's actually important to maintain a lower stake rate. So I think first off, the path dependence of having proof of work before proof of stake was very helpful, which is, the token was live from 2015 to 2022, 7 years, where the token was live and you couldn't stake it. So that just got the token distributed to a lot of people, and it kind of, people didn't only think about using the token. People thought about other things to do with it than just stake it, right? People are using it in DeFi. Maybe they're putting it in Maker or Aave. Maybe they're, buying NFTs with it, whatever. But they're not, kind of default action is not to stake it necessarily. So I think that's a first very important thing. So then once proof of stake becomes active, as we mentioned before, when proof of stake was active, there wasn't actually withdrawals initially. So that meant that it was a higher risk thing. It was like a longer duration, bet if you're going to stake Ethereum. And then once withdrawals were activated, we kind of went from the point where we're at there, which was like 15% staked, all the way up to where we're at today, which is about 28% staked. One other aspect here that is probably worth calling out is that Ether itself has like a lot of utility in the ecosystem broadly, right? So there's many people like use Ether in DeFi. For example, providing liquidity on pools in Uniswap, right? So like the most common trading pair in all of these uni pools is ETH and not a staked ETH, right? So you kind of have to choose when you're deciding whether or not to stake. You have to choose, okay, do I want to stake and earn yield there, or do I want to like deploy into DeFi and earn yield there?
The opportunity cost.
Yeah, there's an opportunity cost here, right?
Yeah.
And because Ether's inflation rate is actually quite low, and I think we'll talk about the exact numbers in a little bit, but right now it's like 3% approximately. So the fact that the yield over the course of the year is quite low means that like that opportunity cost might be quite high, given that outside options might be higher than that. So yeah, I think those are some of the things contributing to it. There's also the reality that like running a solo staker is like relatively complicated and it costs a lot of ETH. So like a lot of people who might have like 2 or 3 ETH instead of having the full 32 would choose not to stake because, you know, it's just like there's too much effort involved into accumulating enough stake to actually deploy a validator. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on there, and it could change. But so that was kind of the first part, which is why I think Ether has a relatively low stake rate. For the second part of the answer, I kind of want to call out why I think it's relatively important for us to maintain that low stake rate. In my mind, it's kind of fundamentally a question of these monetary things that we've been talking about before, and basically the situation where most of the Ether supply gets staked would kind of fundamentally change what it means to hold on to Ether, the native asset itself, because now like most of the liquidity premium actually is coming from a staked version of Ether itself, not from the unstaked version. So that's potentially risky because now you could get into this negative feedback loop where like once you get past like say 50%, maybe almost all of the Ether wants to be staked because they want to, now it's like suddenly a better asset to hold than the raw version of Ether. And so that's kind of like the main concern in my mind for why getting to those higher stake rates could potentially be problematic. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. Another thing that is kind of worth at least calling out about some of the proof of stake chains that have launched later is that oftentimes the tokens, like a much larger percent of the token supply is controlled by the founding team, the foundation, or like the early investors, right? So Ether had the crowd sale, or Ethereum had the crowd sale. Like this was a long time ago. There was only Bitcoin that you could use to buy Ethereum. So it was just like a very different time. And in the transparency report, actually recently, like I only bring this up because it was announced like, I think a month ago. But the EF controls like 0.2% of the total Ether supply, right? And you compare that to other foundations, they might control like 20, 30, 40% of the token supply. And for them to stake it is just kind of like a natural way to deploy that capital and kind of make sure that they're not getting diluted. So yeah, I think there's kind of a lot of factors that contribute to it, but hopefully I covered the big ones there.
Cool. So if we talk about the stakings, so, you know, people's earning the new insurance tokens from the stakings as the yield of the staking. So then we have to, so there has some data. They just show staking growth has outpaced insurance. So could you explain how this dynamic affect Ethers as the monetary properties?
Yeah, sure. So I think here's kind of the point where we can specifically say what the monetary policy of Ethereum is, right, on the inflation side. So it's basically very simple. It's a curve. It's a function that basically says, depending on how much Ether is staked, this is the yield that you get, right? And a few rough numbers are at about 30 million staked ETH. At about 35 million staked ETH, it's about 3% yield. So that's kind of like roughly where we're at today. As you go farther along the amount of Ether staked, like the x-axis there, then the issuance kind of continues to go down. The yield continues to go down. So this basically means that like as more and more ETH gets staked, you get a lower yield because we're kind of saying, we already have enough security. There's already enough stake. We don't need more. Like if we're going to like keep paying out issuance, like we're going to kind of reduce the amount that we have to pay out over time. So yeah, that's kind of how the curve looks, and it scales like 1 over square root. It's an inverse square root, but that doesn't matter too much. What this means is that, you know, as the amount of stake kind of flowing into the system increases, you know, each new staker earns a lower yield on the stake that they deploy. So the kind of ideal here is that instead of going to 100% Ether staked, at some point it's no longer worth it for people to stake and they decide to do something else with their Ether. Like that's the goal. You don't want to get to the 100% staked ETH world. So yeah, I think there's a few things impacting this, and like this is where we're at now is actually kind of an interesting moment because the amount of stake was kind of increasing significantly from like 15% of the total supply staked to like around 28%, which is where we're at now. And then it kind of flattened out. And actually, if you look in the past few weeks, it's gone down a little bit. And the reason it's probably gone down is because the price is going up. So people are probably withdrawing and trying to sell.
Yeah.
Like now there's a high opportunity cost to keeping the stake, right? But yeah, I think there's a few things that could significantly change the landscape. The first is the potential for a staked ETH ETF. And that's like potentially coming down the line. So ETFs are these products that are usually issued by companies in the US. And up until this point, all of the Bitcoin and Ether ETFs have been like just spot ETFs, right? So it means if you buy a share of that ETF, you just get a share of that Bitcoin token, or a share of Ether. Yeah, exactly. A staked ETH ETF would be different because now when you put money into that investment contract, they don't just buy ETH and hold it for you. They actually stake that ETH that they bought. So this can fundamentally, shake things up because now suddenly this spot ETF also has like this interest-bearing component to it. And that might be very attractive to the institutional buyers. So up until this point, there hasn't been a staking component to these contracts because regulation kind of dictated that was probably not going to get approved by the SEC. But it seems like if that does get approved, and I have no idea if it will, like I truly have no idea, but if it does, then that would open up potentially a lot of institutional demand for staking, which I think would potentially push that stake rate up further. Another component here, and yeah, I think this is kind of extremely relevant, which is the broader macro conditions, right? So if you look at the federal funds rate, for example, it's like even higher than the interest that you'd earn on staking, right? So it's about 5% right now, just like you can earn that in a money market fund or in a high interest savings account. You can earn like 2% more just holding US dollars than you can holding ETH, right? And so I think a lot of people are probably looking at that and they're like, why would I stake the ETH? Obviously, the staked ETH, you get like exposure to Ether, the asset. You're kind of like long ETH and your yield is denominated in ETH. So that might be like a positional play. But if you're just like trying to maximize your percentage right now, like holding money market funds is probably better. And so obviously if that rate goes down, if that interest rate kind of is decreased over time, then maybe it would make staking ETH like a more attractive proposition. So yeah, I think that's why like there's kind of all of these things that could change the landscape very quickly. So I think even though we're at only 28% now and it's like relatively low compared to the other chains, I think it's worth acknowledging that like there could be a regime changing shift, and that could push the stake rate to 50%, I think, very, very quickly, like much, much more quickly than people would expect.
I do have one follow-up questions. How do you think about race staking? Is race staking, the currently, especially this year, the race staking is really high. It's really hype. And do you think the race staking gonna increase the Ether staking ratio?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually possible for sure. So the way this would happen, I think the most likely outcome that I could imagine is there's some restaking opportunity that offers like a very high yield. Let's say it's like a 10% yield or something. But the only way you can get access to that yield is by first staking in Ethereum and then restaking it to earn. So yeah, then it kind of changes the calculation, right? Now no longer I'm looking at this 3% Ethereum yield, but I'm also saying, 3% kind of baseline ETH yield, but then I also get the 10% yield for restaking. So now it's like 13%. Like that's a lot better. I'm not sure. I think up until this point, the value of restaking has yet to be materialized. Like I think there was a lot of hype around it. It's a new primitive. It like made a lot of sense to people that like, okay, economic security is like a cool concept that could be used in different ways. So I think there's clearly like sell side of economic security. Like there's many people who are willing to like try and get yield with their ETH. But it's not clear to me that there's much of a buy side, right? Like, what are the protocols that are willing to pay that 10% to get economic security? Those are, I think, yet to materialize. Obviously, I think this is still just very early. Like, there's a lot of very serious teams building restaking projects and projects on top of restaking protocols. So, like, maybe that could, again, I'm totally open to being, to that changing quickly. But I think up until this point, the restaking yields aren't high enough to really like move the needle on the baseline staking yield itself.
Yeah. So then we're back to the staking ratios. So if we're looking at the validator queues and the current trend, do we have some like the equilibrium staking ratio settings? And and what are the implications?
Yeah. So this kind of comes back to the actual curve itself, I think. So Ethereum's monetary policy, as we kind of described before, is it's this decreasing function of the amount of stake in the protocol. So I guess it's worth calling out that this curve is relatively unopinionated in terms of like choosing and like hitting that equilibrium point. Like, I guess the key feature of the curve itself is that at very low amounts of stake, the yield is extremely high. So like if there's less than 5 million Ether staked, for example, then the yield might be like 20%. Like it might be extremely, extremely high. But then once you get past that like 30 million staked ETH mark, from there all the way to 120 million, which is the total supply. So that's like a much bigger range, like 90 million range of Ether. The yield barely changes. Kind of, it goes down slowly, but it goes down from like 3% to 2%. So it only goes down 1% over that entire range. So yeah, I think when people talk about the equilibrium, this kind of depends on all these outside macro things. And in particular, the issuance curve doesn't respond to those very precisely, right? So if there's like, let's say we go full pedal to the metal, we have a staked ETH ETF, and we go to a zero interest rate world, like rates get cut to zero, suddenly everyone wants to deploy capital like into the risk on stuff. The difference between the 3% yield and the 2% yield kind of doesn't mean anything to those people. Like they're just going to go for it because it's like a good option. So when discussing potentially changing the issuance, there's worlds in which you make that taper off like more aggressive. Like you go from 3% to 0% potentially. I mean, there's been discussions around going negative. I don't think that's like in the cards. Like, I just don't think that's very likely. But yeah, another kind of key thing to consider here about that equilibrium is there's kind of two yields that you have to consider. So first is the nominal yield, and this is kind of like your sticker yield, right? This is you press the button and it says, okay, I'm going to get 3%. But the kind of true thing you actually should care about is the real yield, which is the nominal yield minus the inflation. So right now the inflation is about 1% per year. The real yield is the nominal yield is 3%. So the real yield is actually only like 2%. And there's some kind of interesting math that you can do to show that at higher stake rates, even though the nominal yield looks lower, the real yield is actually higher. So there's a world where you really want to conserve the amount of Ether that gets staked to ensure that those real yields stay high, because in the if you take it to the like logical extreme, like let's say you get 100% of Ether staked, this is actually a really bad outcome, because at that point the real yield goes to zero, right? Because now everyone has the same amount of yield that they get per year, 2%, and that just means everyone's network share grows at 2%, right? So this is a potentially bad outcome, because now there's no longer any value from validating the network. Like you're not earning any rewards for doing it, because everyone's just getting inflated away at the same rate. So this might push like the lower margin operators out. This could push the solo stakers out. So really, when we do these analyses and we look at these kind of equilibriums, we also have to think about like the real amount of yield available versus just like what the nominal price is. So yeah, that's an important consideration for sure.
Wow. So if we go back to the Coinbase report, as I just referred to, so they quote, right? So they said dual supply change mechanism, which you already mentioned before, issuance and burning. So could you break down how these two interact with each other?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I like to think of the kind of expansion and the contraction of the monetary supply through the lens of these two mechanisms. So everything that we've been discussing up to this point, or most everything that we've been discussing, has been about how new Ether is created, right? And that's through the staking rewards. That was through the block rewards previously. As we kind of alluded to earlier, there's also this burn mechanism, which is some percentage of the fee that you pay for your transaction gets destroyed. So the kind of cool thing about this is the total supply of Ether can either expand or contract depending on the changes in how much people are willing to pay to get transactions basically included in the blockchain. So we saw this kind of immediately after the merge, where the amount people were willing to pay was actually higher than the issuance itself. And this is kind of what was called the ultrasound period, right? And I actually think this is kind of a really interesting case study because you always have the inflationary pressure coming from people staking. And I like to think of this kind of as the honesty budget. Like this is the amount we're always going to have to pay people to be honest, to validate the network, to keep producing blocks. But then kind of you get the benefit of any usage of the network also kind of contributes to making sure that the inflation remains kind of capped. So that's where this burn mechanism comes in. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a burn from the blob fees itself. So even if some of the transaction fees that were on Ethereum L1 itself are now being, executed on the L2, the L2 in aggregate can burn a lot of blob fees by posting those blobs and making sure that data is available on Ethereum. So yeah, I like to think of it kind of as like a business cycle thing. And I think business cycles are inevitable in, through history. Like
it's always good to grow, mature, and
always booms and busts.
Always like this.
So when there's a boom, I think we are going to be in a world where Ethereum is able to burn a ton of the Ether asset and like reduce the supply. And that will kind of counteract the periods where there's much less activity on chain and the supply is going up because the issuance is not being offset by the transaction fees. So it's kind of like this natural expansion and contraction of the total supply of Ether, which I think is kind of more in line with how kind of financial markets have worked historically. I guess the interesting comparison point is Bitcoin, right? Which is Bitcoin only has this static supply. It's not expanding and contracting, it's just static. And as a result, you have this world where, like, let's say you go into like a long, deep recession or even a second Great Depression, and no one is using the blockchain for anything. Like people are trying to just get food. You know what I mean? Like no one cares about blockchains. But if your blockchain can survive through this 10-year depression, then like it'll come out stronger on the other end. But Bitcoin during this whole 10-year period, there's going to be like essentially zero transaction fees, right? And if the block reward is zero by this point, then there's kind of no reason for people to keep mining on the longest chain. Like they might try and switch chains. They might try and reorg the selfish mine, do all sorts of random stuff because there's no incentive to behave honestly. And actually there's like one really interesting data point here is kind of coming back to these Bitcoin Renaissance things that we were talking about. You can also have these situations where the transaction fees change extremely high amounts in a short period of time. And Ethereum kind of accounts for this by burning most of that, right? So if Ethereum has an exponentially increasing base fee. So if many blocks are full in a row, then the price of the base fee, which is the amount that gets burned, goes up exponentially quickly. But Bitcoin doesn't have any mechanism like that. So let's say like when the Babylon chain launched, this actually happened like a few months ago. When Babylon chain launched, the block reward or like the transaction fees generated on the Bitcoin block went from 0.03 Bitcoins to 15.5 over the course of 4 blocks. So that's 500x increase in the size of the transaction fees over that short period of time. And so there's kind of like, there's all of these things that could call into question, like how stable the fork choice rule is effectively. Once, and so that's why I really like the kind of expansion and contraction that the 1559 along with the kind of issuance curve for the Ethereum monetary policy work together. That's how I would describe it.
Yeah, I think that is more like the flexibilities. So it's just like the real world economy. So every sovereign countries, they have to have the flexibilities and to against the unpredictable market conditions, no matter the economic conditions or political conditions or whatsoever, or the external potential risks.
Yeah, exactly. I think trying to be, Ethereum is aiming to be like maximally robust. So still secure, still permissionless, still credibly neutral, but also like flexible and kind of pragmatic around how macro cycles work.
Yeah.
So basically, during the high network activity, which you already mentioned, the ultrasound period, how important is the narrative for its monetary status?
Yeah. So I think ultrasound money was a good meme because it helped people kind of understand the supply and contraction things that we were just talking about. But I do think tying like the value proposition of Ether to the ultrasound meme, I think is something we should try and move away from generally, because I don't think as I mentioned before, I don't think we're going to have kind of extended periods of deflation that last forever. And you can reason this through by just saying, okay, what if there's like, it's impossible for there to be deflation forever, because deflation forever just means there's no more tokens left, right? So that like by definition, that doesn't make any logical sense.
Any sense, yeah.
So yeah, I think potentially much more important than like being net deflationary is actually just saying we have like a reasonable mechanism by which we control the rate of inflation. And that's like a two-part thing. The one part is the fact that the issuance is quite low, like it's the curve already only gives 3% yield. And we have this burn that absorbs a lot of the excess demand and uses that to offset some more of the inflation. So yeah, I don't think kind of being ultrasound for ultrasound's sake is necessarily important. And you can kind of see that from Bitcoin itself, right? Like Bitcoin is a much bigger asset than Ether in terms of like market cap, and it doesn't have there's no like ultrasound deflationary mechanics for Bitcoin. So it's clearly also not necessary that the token supply decreases over time. It's more about creating like a shared understanding and a shared story of what the total supply is and what the inflation rate is generally. And I think that's kind of fundamentally what we're trying to communicate is just like, hey, Ethereum's monetary policy makes a lot of sense. It's this simple curve, and then it has this burn side that kind of absorbs the excess demand and burns ETH. So like just communicating the story in a simple way feels more important than it being like Ether remaining ultrasound for any extended period of time, in my mind.
I think the meme things is I think most of the ideology things always need to get it be the meme, and in order to let people to understand and in order to let people to accept those ideologies.
Yeah. I mean, money is a really interesting thing. There was this quote that I put in one of my DevCon talks, which is from David Graeber. And he basically said, money isn't really anything. So it's going to be hard. Like, I think the reason people have a hard time with these arguments is because they're inherently like soft. They're almost more like social science questions than they are like hard science and math. Like you can't like prove that something is money. It just like has these emergent things. And generally speaking, it's a lot about shared expectation and like managing how people perceive the asset itself. And yeah, that's a very difficult thing to do. So I think a lot of it is storytelling, a lot of it is narrative, and that's what Bitcoin does really well. And that's what Ether should actually learn from, I think.
Exactly. We've done an episode at the very, very early stage and talk about what really money is. So actually money is something to prove the social connections. So just like I need some things to prove that we have the good relationship. You are my friend, you are my family, so I use something. So that thing is talk about money. So that is the money. So I think most of people, because we're the social animals. Every human being is social animals. We need something to bonding each other. So I think that is money. And that is more like the philosophy questions. Everybody has their own angles about what what they think money it is, right?
Yeah. And also it's a consensus. It's also a consensus, right? Before the blockchain consensus, it's the same idea.
Yep.
without tech.
So yeah, let's back to the Ethereum itself. So for the future development. So currently we're talking about all about insurance and burning things. And to talk about insurance, I know there's things to talk about like the insurance parameters. And I know in the communities, a lot of people, they are talking about whether there has potentially opportunities we can adjusting those insurance parameters. So what factors should be considered when evaluate such changes?
Yeah, right. So I guess the story of changing the issuance was something I kind of talked about earlier in like right at the beginning when we were talking about a history of the hard forks. There was kind of two very key moments where the inflation rate changed significantly from 5 ETH to 3 ETH, from 3 ETH to 2 ETH. So like there is a precedent for this to happen. I think so. It's worth saying that it hasn't changed since the merge, and it is kind of increasingly a very, very political topic because changing the issuance also like directly impacts some businesses that rely on that curve, right? So all of the liquid staking tokens, all of the staking providers, many big institutions like have a vested interest in not changing the issuance curve, and I think it's like some of the arguments that they bring up are totally valid, which is like, we don't want to change the curve kind of arbitrarily. Like it shouldn't be up to the whims of a single person. Like Vitalik shouldn't just be able to go in and be the central banker of Ethereum. Like that's not how this system works, right? Like that's not what we want.
No.
But I think if we can agree on, I guess, the goals of the staking system, then convince ourselves that the ways to achieve those goals is by reducing the issuance, then I think that would be like the grounds to kind of motivate such a change. And obviously like any change to Ethereum, it takes an immense amount of kind of community support. There's many rounds of kind of proposing EIPs. They go through the all core devs process. Like this whole process is very kind of intentionally slow because we don't want changes to get through kind of haphazardly. Like we want it to be very intentional. So I guess in terms of defining the reason or like the goals, I think the main thing that feels very important to maintain and preserve is the value of holding Ether in an unstaked capacity. And to me, this kind of comes back to the fundamental like permissionless properties of ETH. So like when we're onboarding new users to the ecosystem, they shouldn't have to make a decision, which is which like staked ETH derivative do I hold? They should just be able to buy ETH and use it on the network, and it should be like a totally good experience for them. And so the kind of risk that the risk that we're trying to avoid is that one liquid staking token, for example, becomes the de facto money and becomes like the default option for people when they onboard into the ecosystem. And as we described before, the reason this could happen is if the liquidity effects and the network effects of that asset become greater than Ether, right? Like if, for example, there's more stETH, like let's just use staked ETH, the liquid staking token that's issued by Lido. If there's more stETH than native ETH in the ecosystem, like it's more useful in DeFi, NFTs are being purchased in it, it has like all of these kind of monetary properties that are more attractive than holding ETH, then basically like a new user into the system probably has to acquire stETH instead of ETH. Now, you might say, okay, this is fine, like stETH is relatively good as far as LSTs go, but I think fundamentally you do give up some of the kind of promises of crypto assets. So I think of like some of the core promises of crypto assets that we ask for are like self-sovereignty, right? If you own the keys, if you own the private keys, you can control the tokens, and censorship resistance and kind of the whole idea of the property rights of these digital assets, right? If you're forced to hold stETH, then you do take on counterparty risk, which is you take on the risk of Lido and the staking node providers and everything involved with operating those validators. So I guess fundamentally that feels like a problem. And then the other thing I'll say here is that if one entity controls too much of the system, then you get into this potentially like too big to fail situation, right?
It's more like the bank.
it just feels like a bank, right? Like, you have all of these concentration of power and wealth, and it gets to a world where potentially like 60, 70% of all Ether is staked through one protocol. And then that protocol effectively like has way too much influence in the ecosystem. I think this is a very difficult thing to fight against, right? Like centralization is common in a lot of areas of finance and like tech. Like there's 4 big tech companies, right? There's 2 big AI labs. Like concentration is everywhere in the world. And so I think what we're doing is kind of trying to fight against something natural, but yeah, ensuring that no one piece of the Ethereum ecosystem gets so big that it controls the entire thing feels like kind of core to preserving the neutrality and the permissionlessness of the system. So yeah, that's kind of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think there's kind of a compelling argument to be made that in order to achieve that outcome, you actually have to reduce the issuance curve. And this is kind of, this is where I'll show my cards a little bit. Like, I think this is an important thing that we should do. Obviously, like people should definitely read both sides of the argument, try and come to their own conclusion. But this all comes down to the thing that I mentioned before, which is that from 30 million staked ETH to 120 million staked ETH, the yield only decreases by 1%. So like there's very little opinion being in the current version of the curve. Like it's a very kind of gradual change, and just tweaking the parameters to make it more opinionated and to say, hey, we want to like decrease this rate faster feels like a key component of achieving a lower, like maintaining that lower stake rate that we have now. So yeah, again, a very political topic. Yeah. I want everyone to read the other side of the argument too. Like, but that's kind of where I land on it.
I remember yesterday, I think Bankless posted Twitter and just one picture, and that picture said a guy's going to the bank, and the guy talked to the cashier and said, I want to get permissions to use my own money.
Yes.
Yep.
It's very ironic, but yeah, maybe we didn't feel that way, but actually that is how we live in the current order situations. But yeah, that is too politic. Let's move on. Let's move on. So I know, so currently we do have some changes like the proto dank sharding. So I definitely not tech background. So I do want to know what sort of like those change like the proto dank sharding affect Ethereum money properties.
Yeah, this is another example of like a naming thing that is it's just
exactly
word, right? Like these are just not real words.
But. The meme piece is really useful,
Yeah. Right. So proto-dank sharding is actually already live. So that's the thing that happened with EIP 4844. So the thing that changed is now Ethereum blocks can have three blobs. Let's just say 3. There can be up to 6, but on average, there's only 3 blobs per block. And each of these blobs is just kind of unstructured data. It's just like, they could be anything. You could put like, someone put like the transcript to the B movie in there, or like you could put like songs in there. You could just write arbitrary data there. So this is kind of the first part of the rollup centric roadmap, which is allowing them to post data to these blobs, allowing rollups, that is. The next kind of continuation of this theme is to continue scaling Ethereum up as a DA layer. And that involves that's really just getting the number of blobs per block up. So currently we're at 3. At the end game, when you get to full dank sharding, the proposal is that there'll be 128. So like a massive increase in the number of blocks, like over something like a 50x increase, right? A little less, but increase in the number of blobs per block. The real value that these blobs provide is that they extend the block space that's available to rollups to consume. And the core feature of rollups that like I think is very important to highlight, and this is kind of what I tried to hammer home in the DevCon talk, is they extend the property rights of ETH asset, right? Instead of going to your bank and asking for permission to your money, even if you bridge your Ether to an L2 and that L2 decides that they want to start censoring you for whatever reason, they can't steal your money. Like they can't freeze your assets, right? So imagine a world where Wells Fargo and JP Morgan and all the big banks have rollups, right? This is maybe a weird hypothetical future, but like bear with me. And when you deposit money, instead of depositing it into the bank, you deposit onto their rollup, right? Now, if JP Morgan Chase gets like a notice from a government that says, okay, you have to freeze this person's assets, they would no longer be able to if you have that rollup is posting blobs to Ethereum and it's using Ethereum as a settlement layer. So yeah, this is kind of the fundamental core property of this permissionlessness and the censorship resistance, which is extended, like these property rights are extended to any rollups that use Ethereum DA. So that's kind of, that's a like, I guess the initial push is scaling Ethereum block space and execution, but you also do get to scale the property rights of ETH asset. There's kind of many ways that you could imagine this also benefits Ether the asset. So I guess when you Google kind of what is money, there's a few things that show up usually. The first is the store of value. And that's mostly that's mostly what we've been talking about so far, right? Like a capped inflation, you have like an understandable monetary policy, these types of things. The other two are a little, I think they're kind of related. One of them is called unit of account, and the other is medium of exchange. Unit of account usually talks about kind of, is this something that people use to measure other things against? And I think the great example here is meme coins, right? Like if you look at meme coins and all of the, and NFTs too, let's clump both those together. Both of those are denominated in ETH, right? Like I have a Milady, I bought it for 0.4 ETH. It's now worth like 5 ETH or something. But I never like consider the US dollar values of it. I just think about it in terms of like what's its Ether value, right? And meme coins in these liquidity pools, like usually the denominator of the pool is like a meme coin and then ETH. So you swap it against ETH. So now you're measuring the price of the meme coin in ETH. So that's kind of like this unit of account thing. Medium of exchange is more like, is this asset used to conduct kind of economic activity broadly, right? So this could be paying for gas. This could be taking out a loan in Aave. Like all of these kind of DeFi things that involve you using Ether to do something are kind of part of this medium of exchange. So this is kind of a long-winded response to your question, but when you scale up Ethereum DA, you also kind of expand the surface area of rollups that are kind of using Ether, the asset, both as a unit of account and as a medium of exchange. So that kind of increases the monetary properties. And also, I think you kind of scale that permissionlessness of Ether, the asset. You maintain that credible neutrality, which I think is like so core to what Ethereum is building. So, I mean, this is kind of a broader meta commentary on like why the rollup centric roadmap as a directional choice is what Ethereum is going for. And I think, scaling it as a DA layer, scaling it as a settlement layer for rollups is like a core part of that rollup centric roadmap vision. And that's kind of where we're going in the subsequent years, hopefully.
Because you've already talked about your talk about permissionless money, but I think you've covered most of it. So I do want to back to the second part about Ether is money part. So, right? So you positioned Ether as a money rather than the purely investment asset. So given the money traditional needs the relative stabilities to function effectively, how do you reconcile this with market expectation for the cryptocurrency appreciations? Everybody's looking for the Ether's price goes up. And does the positioning the Ether as the money rather than the speculative asset create any tensions with the market sentiment?
Actually, this is the question. Sorry, Mike. This is the question most of our audience really want to know, and because your
because
videos
they hold
already
Ether.
Published. Because that's a joke. When the Bitcoin price go really high, and then the people said like also a meme, right? But I only got ETH.
Yeah.
I only have ETH. so I think that's the question that people really want to know about because of your talk. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
So please go ahead.
I guess there's a few things here. Certainly Ether is not trying to maintain price stability, right? Like I think Ether is, it's not trying to be a stable coin or like be pegged to a basket of goods or anything like that. It is a speculative asset. It will kind of fluctuate with the market. And as we saw over the past few days, like its price can change like 17% or whatever. So yeah, I definitely do think using it as an everyday token that you like denominate your wealth in is probably too volatile for most people, right? That being said, so like this is kind of the same feature that Bitcoin has too, right? Which is these things they're very good stores of value, and people do like holding wealth in them, and they do think they will continue to hold that value over time. But actually, like using them daily is potentially like too volatile to happen. So I think one area that Ethereum is kind of uniquely positioned to try and do is to capitalize on these kind of crypto denominated stablecoins, right? So I think Maker and Dai are, well, I guess it got rebranded to Sky and USDS.
Sky, yes.
Yeah. But they're a great example of kind of a token that can be used, like USDS is denominated in US dollars. This is like a very familiar concept to people, but it doesn't have the counterparty risk of USDC and USDT, which is, you're using a bank on the back end to hold that value. It's actually, the value is denominated in ETH. It's just used to like make these permissionless decentralized stablecoins. So I think like a world in which the price of ETH is very, is still relatively volatile, but there are stablecoins that are denominated or like are backed by ETH, but are issued in terms of a more stable unit of account, I think probably makes a lot of sense. There's also other versions of this, like Rye is one that gets discussed a lot, where it's not trying to hold a peg to any specific thing, but it's trying to kind of smooth out the volatility of the price fluctuations of Ether. So, if Ether kind of is this giant sine wave, then it would be like a smaller sine wave that's like much compressed. And that's like the simplest way to describe it. And I think that could be potentially useful. But yeah, I agree. When people think about money, I think they oftentimes think like, okay, I have like $1, I have some money in my pocket and I go to the coffee shop and I give them the money and they give me a coffee. And I don't think, at least in the time being, I don't think Ether will kind of move into that form of money for people. I think it's going to remain kind of highly volatile. Also, I mean, kind of, it is also worth saying that like as time goes on, maybe the amount of volatility will reduce as there's kind of like this price discovery. Like everyone comes to consensus, kind of rough consensus through the market of what this thing is worth, and then it doesn't need to go up and down by 17% all the time. But I still think we're far away from that, and gold still goes up and down a lot. So like, maybe this is just how humans work.
Yeah, especially if you put some things on the market, so that is out of your control. You're always all the market waitings to let the price goes up and goes down. I think we are about to closing our conversation, so I do have the final questions. It's about your final thoughts. Any final thoughts on the Ethereum's journey towards becoming the monetary asset?
Yeah, I still kind of want to return to the core thing, which is I think ETH should try to position as permissionless money, right? And this is really the original version of the kind of cypherpunk values that Satoshi put in the Bitcoin white paper. But in my mind, like without censorship resistance and without credible neutrality, what we're building isn't actually that differentiated from traditional finance and traditional tech, right? So like if your assets can be seized, if there's censorship, if you're trusting some counterparty in some way, like USDC or USDT, you're trusting the issuer of that stablecoin, then I think what we're building, like, sure, it might be cool tech, it might be interesting, it might be like better than the existing fintech, but fundamentally it's like, it's no different in what it can offer to humans. And yeah, so I think kind of focusing in on that permissionlessness and that censorship resistance and that credible neutrality is like the core thing that we need to focus on. And I think that's what will be most valuable too, right? Like, I think if you think about the amount of global wealth and how much of it is going to want to be sanctioned, is going to be willing to be censored, you know what I mean? Like if you just take the net assets of the world, I think in aggregate, most of those assets will kind of want to be free, for lack of a better word. Like they don't want to be subject to any jurisdiction or any counterparty risk. And so I think kind of beyond just saying like, oh, we think these are the right values, I think it's actually like the product offering of Ether, the asset, being like truly permissionless money is going to be very compelling compared to other crypto assets, compared to other fiat currencies. So yeah, I think that's where I hope Ethereum lands in the future.
Yeah, I think that it's just like before the Ethereum, I think the Swiss bank is taking this road. Everyone, right? Yeah, everyone they are save their money in the Swiss bank because they are because they are free
the neutrality.
Yeah, exactly. But currently, along with the technology going on, so I think the Ethereum maybe is the next Swiss bank for all those of the wealthies. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you, Mike. And I'm very appreciate that you can bring such sharp insights to our Chinese audiences. And I do believe our Chinese audiences definitely will enjoy your episodes and enjoy what you are thinking. And we hope that you give a lot of the confidence to the ETH holders and the Ethereum builders.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. In this episode, we will publish in two versions. So in case you don't understand the English, so we will translate it as the Chinese. We will publish at the same time. And the second, this is also will be the videos. So you can follow us on the YouTube and the Chinese versions on the Bilibili. So everything will have the Chinese subtitles. So we definitely will make sure you understand everything's Mike talk. Yeah. So thank you, Mike. Thank you again. And thank you for joining us, everybody. I'll see you next week. Bye.
Thank you so much, Mike. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.
My hips are swaying side to side, the lungs they holler high. It brings the people out tonight. I need that swinging rhythm.